Trustee Cook, Trustee Cheen, Student Trustee McCowie, and Student Trustee Hawkins. And then Trustee Burgess is on her way, so we actually don't have quorum, but we're going to start anyway, as we only have one item of business on our agenda, and we have a few things that we can get through while Trustee Burgess makes her way in. So firstly, sorry, now that we've done attendance, I'm just going to read the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we are on land and surrounded by water, originally inhabited by Indigenous peoples who have traveled this area since time immemorial. This territory is within the lands honored by the Wampum Treaties, agreements between the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenni Lenape, and allied nations to peacefully share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Specifically, we would like to acknowledge the presence of the Three Fires Confederacy, the Ojibwe, Odawa, Potawatomi, and Huron-Wendat peoples. We are dedicated to honoring Indigenous history and culture while remaining committed to moving forward respectfully with all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. Okay. Are there any declarations of conflict of interest? Okay. Seeing none, there are no presentations, as we will present the budget when we get to new business. There are no delegations at the time of agenda preparation, and there was nobody on the speakers list as of today. And so we are on to H1, which is approval of the 2022-2023 budget. And so I will turn this over to Superintendent Armstrong and Mr. Mayhew, who will begin a presentation, and then shortly thereafter we will move the agenda once we have quorum. Thank you. Yes. Oh, I'm so sorry. Thank you for that. And sorry, back to item C. Can I get approval of agenda, trustees? Oh, wait, we can't. Okay. Well, there's 6 in because Trustee Hatfield is on the phone.
6 and a 9.
Okay. Okay, so we're going to proceed with approval of the agenda with 6 of us with Trustee Hatfield on the phone. So Trustee Sartori, seconded by Trustee Higginson. Any opposition? Okay, seeing none. And we will skip back down to the presentation of the budget. Over to you.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to sit while I do this. So just so everyone knows. So I would like to express my sincere appreciation to Mr. Mayhew and the entire finance team for their hard work, their diligence, and their commitment to completing the budget document, as well as preparing the ministry EFIS forms, which we don't ever really talk about in this meeting, and all the work that goes into preparing all the budget reports that we bring forward to trustees throughout the year. I'd also like to thank Tammy, Tammy Meloche, because she really does keep us organized, on track, and she keeps everything coordinated and organized. So thank you for that. So on the next slide is just an outline of the agenda that we will be going through. I'm not planning to read it, but we'll go through each item. So on the next section, I'm going to take a few minutes just to explain to you about the budget process and the budget timelines. So as you'll see on this slide, there are a number of activities that are involved in the preparation of the budget. It starts with the budget timelines being announced, which we did at the beginning of February. The board conducted a public budget consultation survey, which ran for a period of February the 15th to May 31st, because we also had public consultation meetings here at our board meetings. The GSN was released on February the 17th, and we did a public budget consultation through Microsoft Teams to members of the community on March the 29th. As well, we provided trustees with 3 different updates in terms of the budget, and also provided opportunities for public consultation, as noted on the slide. And the draft package was provided to you on June the 10th, and we are here this evening to present the draft budget to you. And then just quickly, lastly, our ministry submission is due on June the 30th. The board is committed to continuous improvement in its budget process. In order to improve transparency of the use of public funds, the board implemented several enhancements to its budget process as noted on this slide. There was research that was conducted on what other Ontario District School Boards were doing for their processes. We also conducted a survey of Ontario District School Boards to better understand specific items with respect to their budget. We made much more effective use of social media to solicit public consultation. And as well, we did a community presentation through Microsoft Teams to explain about education funding, the budget process, what our board initiatives are, and to provide an opportunity for questions. And we fully acknowledge it's not perfect, and that we're committed to making further refinements when we come to the 2023-24 budget process. On this slide, this just provides a high level in terms of the actual budget survey that was conducted starting at the beginning of February, and it closed at the end of March. This survey we promoted through a variety of social media platforms to get the word out, and as well it was mentioned at the public board meetings, and there was a media release regarding that. And as you'll see, we had close to 9,400 social media reaches with respect to the budget content, and there were 810 responses, and in terms of the breakdown, that is noted on the slide. This slide here will indicate or provides a little bit of feedback on the budget survey results and the key findings. There was a comprehensive memo that was provided to trustees on that back in April. As you'll see on this slide, there were 5 areas that the community, which consisted of parents, students, staff, community partners, childcare. There were 5 areas that, from a public's perspective, felt there was sufficient funding already allocated. And those are the first 5 items that you'll see noted at the top of the slide. And then at the bottom of the slide are 5 areas that the public felt there was insufficient funding that was allocated. And that included mental health and well-being for students, mental health and well-being for staff, arts, technology resources, and outdoor education. And we'll discuss that a little bit more in some subsequent slides coming up. So I'm going to turn over to Sean at this point to talk about the funding overview.
Okay, the next few slides will review how public education is funded before we get into our specific board funding. The Grants for Student Needs, or GSN, provides 95% of the Greater Essex County District School Board's funding. This funding flows directly from the Ministry of Education. The Ministry of Education also provides the board with supplemental funding to the GSN known as Priorities and Partnership Funding, or PPF for short. PPF grants are reviewed and assessed by the Ministry of Education annually and represents approximately approximately 1% of the board's total annual funding. The ministry also provides all capital funding. Other ministries and sources represent approximately 4% of our total funding. For example, funding to support our employment services and literacy and basic skills programs flows from these other ministries. Other sources includes tuition from international fee-paying students, energy rebates, interest, income, and other miscellaneous sources. Public education funding is provided by the Ministry of Education. Education is the second largest sector of the provincial budget, healthcare sector being the largest. The Education Act sets forth the formula for education funding, as we discussed, known as the Grants for Student Needs, or GSN for short. And that's the primary source of funding for public school boards in Ontario. The GSN is intended to provide a fair allocation for all students wherever they live in Ontario, operate in a manner that's fair and non-discriminatory between both public and Catholic school boards and both English language and French language systems, provide funding to maintain schools and to build new schools where they are needed, allow school boards some flexibility to decide how they will be, how funds will be allocated to programs and supports, and also restrict how school boards spend some money in specific areas such as special education and other enveloped areas, which we'll talk about later. And of course, the GSN promotes school board accountability by ensuring that school boards report consistently and publicly on how they spend their allocations. Of the total $26 billion provided by the grants for student needs, our board's portion is approximately $441.6 million, and the GSN's made up of three main components: the Pupil Foundation Grant, the School Foundation Grant, and 15 special purpose grants. The allocation for each component is shown in the pie chart. You'll see that just over half of the GSN comes from the two foundation grants, and the remaining funding are from the special purpose grants, and we'll review those in further detail. This slide illustrates how the funding flows to school boards. Municipalities collect property taxes and send payments to local school boards. The funding formula is set by the Government of Ontario. The province then transfers from income tax and sales tax the difference between a school board's entitlement under the funding formula and the revenue from its property taxes. Therefore, school boards have revenues from both provincial transfers and revenue from property taxes.
So I just wanted to spend just a couple of minutes on a couple slides about planning assumptions for the current year's budget. So of course, our budget is always designed or drafted so that it aligns with the board's mission, vision, and strategic priorities. We always take on the assumption of conservative enrollment projections. That's done intentionally because we don't want to be in a position where we've overstated funding revenue, only to find when you get to October 31st and you get your count date that the enrollment is significantly lower than that. We always adhere to all collective agreements and other contractual obligations when we develop the budget and the associated expenses. There's always a provision for the director's contingency, which is what we call some funding that we put aside to support unanticipated expenditures. As well, we always ensure adherence to the Education Act, the enveloping provisions that are contained in the funding formulas, and any guidelines that are provided by the ministry that are associated with that funding. Additionally, we are assuming for 22-23 that enhanced health and safety protocols will be required to continue. So that includes that the ventilation measures that we've adopted for this current school year will continue with systems running longer. As well, we are also assuming that we will need to continue with the frequent cleaning of high-touch surfaces. And so that is considered in this budget as well. Remote learning option is an assumption that we know we need to provide as part of the next school year, and that it will be available to all students. We'll talk about that a little bit further in the budget with respect to some challenges with respect to that. As well, we are assuming that all classes will continue to operate on a format based on a regular school day, and that school will remain open for the full school year. In terms of risks and opportunities, there are several. It's inherent because the budget is a projection. It's based, it's a look forward in terms of what we anticipate revenues and expenses to be, and of course, that's founded on certain assumptions. So you'll see on this slide, there is a list of several risks. I shouldn't even use the word opportunities, primarily risks associated with this budget, and we're just going to go through each one very briefly. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sean to speak specifically about enrollment.
Okay. Since enrollment is the primary driver of funding, estimates used for enrollment in the 22-23 budget are a risk, as variations can significantly affect funding. Enrollment projections are conservative in nature as they are based on known registrations at the time they are completed. So any delayed registrations, late registrations may not be captured in this budget, and we hope there's many of those. The pandemic has had a significant impact on enrollment. Since 2019-2020, overall enrollment has decreased approximately 936 students, which includes 106 international students. A reminder that for funding purposes, enrollment is counted on October 31st and March 31st, and an average is taken to form ADE, or average daily enrollment. This chart shows the budget-to-budget change in elementary enrollment. So last year's budget compared to this year's budget, you'll see that budget-to-budget, we're projecting a decrease of 156 students. And this chart shows the secondary change, budget to budget, and we're showing an increase in the secondary panel of 147 students. So you'll see that if you net the two, we're only really expecting a decrease of 9 students year over year, budget to budget. I think it's important too to kind of put enrollment in picture of a 5-year, I guess, timeline to see what actual enrollment we experienced over the last 5 years. And this kind of shows a bit of the picture. You'll see it's from 2016-17 we've increased, then we increased again in 2018-19, increased in 19-20. We were kind of on that upward trend, and then that whole thing happened in March 2020, and you'll see we have a bit of drop off there. And based on our, you want me to get into that? Yeah. So we know what happened, and we know that as a result, there's been a drop off of enrollment. And I think this is another enrollment trend I want to show to depict, I guess, from that point of March 2020, what's happened. And you can see that kind of drop off there, and it shows that we've lost almost, I believe, 1,000 students moving from March 2020 to the current picture.
Some other risks and opportunities with respect to the budget. One, of course, is the political landscape. So we had our provincial election on June the 2nd. We have a municipal election coming up in October. And the impact of that, of those changes in government, we could or could not have a new Minister of Education. We don't know yet. The composition of our Board of Trustees could change. And we don't know if the ministry funding models or education priorities are going to change as well. So, I mean, we've made assumptions based on what things are currently, but that obviously could change. Our collective agreements all expire on August the 31st, 2022. All the financial terms are negotiated centrally, so that is not something here locally as a board that we would have influence on. And we don't know yet, but there could be implications from potential job action, withdrawal of service, or strike action, which would have an impact on the services we're providing to students and potentially the expenses of the board. COVID-19 still is a risk that we've identified for our budget. As we've indicated, the state of the pandemic, new variants, any potential ministry direction on required health and safety measures, other than the enhanced ventilation and cleaning measures, which we already know that we need to do, could have an impact on the budget. The ministry has also directed boards to offer a remote learning option. However, our board survey to families and students will not be released until the end of July. So as a result, we don't know the number of students that will elect to participate in remote learning. And as a result, our budget, or the draft budget, does not contain any staffing costs associated with a remote learning option for students at this time. Ministry funding also for COVID-19 is reduced. Some of that funding has been incorporated directly into the GSN. Some of it has been discontinued altogether. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in further slides as well. Absenteeism is a regular risk that we always bring forward with respect to our budget. The replacement costs for our occasional teachers, our educational support staff, and casual custodians represents $11.2 million in the 22-23 budget. The current budget, the budget for the prior year was the same amount, so there has been no increase that's been allocated for that. However, we do acknowledge that the board is experiencing an escalating number of cognitive-related illnesses, such as mental health or stress leaves, over the prior year, presumably associated in part with COVID-19, but that could have an impact on the budget moving forward. Special education, we've talked about this too for as long as I've been with the board, and I'm sure long before that. It is chronically underfunded. There is no question about that. And the board does reallocate non-enveloped funding to support the changing and the greater needs of our students in our system. For the 22-23 school year, the funding deficit for special education is budgeted to be $9.1 million. The year prior to that was $3.8 million. So we are funding that difference of the $5.3 million through non-enveloped funding elsewhere in the budget to support that. Supply chain issues are a significant risk for all organizations, the board notwithstanding. The inflationary market has reduced the purchasing power of our ministry funding. Prices are volatile, and vendors and service providers are not willing to hold pricing for any extended length of time. There's also a demand for skilled trades, and it's difficult to secure the services, and it's expensive to do so. As well, there are long lead times to acquire goods and services due to the impacts from COVID-19, which continue to plague the supply chain. And while our GSN funding is increased by 2.3% to account for inflation, it's insufficient compared to the realized inflation rate that's currently being experienced in the marketplace. As a result, the board is prioritizing and monitoring its purchasing activities very carefully to account for the implicit reduction in funding for our non-salary based costs. Utilities, again, is a very common risk that we bring up. Unpredictable weather, we've talked about force majeure events, the changes in legislation with respect to the carbon tax, energy markets and utility providers having to make infrastructure upgrades, and of course those costs get passed down to the consumer. We continue to run our ventilation systems on a more extended period of time, which results in usage of utilities. And then there's the rising prices associated with natural gas because of the influence from the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And so that could potentially be an issue depending on the number of hot weather days, cold weather days that we have, and any other issues that come up. WSIB is another risk. The board is a Schedule II employer, and under the WSIB Act, the board assumes the responsibility for the payment of all claims to its injured workers under the Act. And so we can't predict what those incidences will be. We certainly try to be very careful with the conditions of work, but the board does not fund these obligations in advance of the payments. So as costs continue to rise and the complexity of work-related injuries rises, and as I mentioned in a previous slide, we're seeing a lot more of the cognitive-related workplace incidences, there is a risk that claims and costs could actually be higher than what we've budgeted. Running out of juice. Okay, no worries. Next slide. Claims, grievances, and legal settlements is, again, it's a risk, I would think, for any organization. The board is, and in particular with a school board too, the board is experiencing continuous exposure to claims, grievances, and legal settlements. These events are difficult to predict, and the amount of any potential liability is not easily estimable. I can get that word out. You know what I mean. There's also some claims that have no limitation period, and so that continually influences the level of risk to the board's budget as a result. Aging infrastructure. We talk about this a lot too. Some of our buildings are quite old, where we're grateful for the capital priority funding that we do get to build new spaces and new additions. But unexpected repairs, they can create havoc to your budget. And so we've identified this as a risk. As you can see from this slide, we do have significant renewal needs based on the ministry's most recent assessment. Construction of new schools through capital priority funding obviously will help reduce some of those renewal needs, but clearly not at the rate that is being identified right now. And the last risk and opportunity to the board is related to actuarial assumptions. The board does have liabilities for retirement benefits and retirement gratuities, which are based on a number of assumptions, including the discount rate for those liabilities. We do rely on an actuary to value the liabilities and the underlying expense. And as we have changes in actuarial assumptions and in the discount rate over the actuarially determined liabilities, it could have a positive or a negative impact on the budget. But many times we would not know that until the end of the year when the actuarial report is completed. So there's one tiny little opportunity in all that I shared. With that, I'll turn it over to Sean.
Okay. This next section will focus on details surrounding the board's 22-23 draft budget. This slide provides an overview of the operating revenues and expenditures. The board is presented with a balanced budget for ministry compliance purposes. Total revenues of $490.2 million are equal to total expenses of $490.2 million. It's always the board's objective to ensure a budget is presented that is in compliance with the ministry requirements. Compliance is discussed in Section 1.9 of the budget memo. Section 231 of the Education Act defines compliance as in-year deficits that are the lesser of 1, the accumulated surplus from the preceding year, or 2, 1% of the board's operating revenue. So a balanced budget would be in compliance with those requirements. And as this slide shows, the board is presented a budget that's completely in compliance also with the board administration and governance expenses. This table provides the continuity of the board's accumulated surplus. The net 2022-23 in-year activity equals 0. No surplus or deficit for ministry compliance purposes, as mentioned. The capital portion represents unsupported projects such as LaSalle Public School and Better Places. This balance is reduced each year by depreciation of these assets. A portion is in the compliance adjusted. A small portion does not qualify for the adjustment, approximately $51,000. So you'll see there's a slight surplus in the operating to allow for the difference in the compliance adjustment to get us to a ministry net of 0. Note that the projection on this slide does not consider the surplus deficit for the 21-22 school year. This will be determined with the finalization of the fiscal year end in October 2022. The board's projecting it will require the use of at least 1% of its operating allocation from accumulated surplus, translating to about $4.2 million deficit. The projection also does not reflect the appropriation of surplus for Kingsville JK-12, minor tangible capital assets of $3.1 million, which is required by the board, by the Ministry of Education. I'll turn it back over to Shelley.
Thanks, Sean. So for the next few slides, we wanted to take an opportunity to outline the budget initiatives that are being implemented to support the board's strategic priorities, as well as the areas that are identified throughout the public budget consultation process. So as we have said before, the strategic priorities we consider throughout the entire budget process, with student success and well-being at the core of our budget development. So specifically with respect to student success and well-being, in comparison to the budget from last year for 21-22, the additional investments that are reflected in the 22-23 budget are outlined on this slide. So there are additional supports for student mental health, and those include the addition of 1 FTE for a well-being teacher, 1 FTE for an applied behavior analyst, facilitator, 1 FTE for a behavior analyst, 1 FTE social worker to support student mental health and well-being, and as well the supplies and resources budget has been increased by $50,000 to provide further assistance. As well, we have full-time ABA and BAs for the early years program. And a portion of the budgeted social working staff will also be supporting early years. And in total, of the total 22-23 budget, $4.8 million has been set aside for student mental health initiatives. With respect to creating confident learners, investments again compared to the prior year's budget, there's an investment of 63.0 FTE additional special education supports, 16 FTE additional Jordan Principal Education Assistants. So that brings a total of 35 in total that are in the budget. There's an additional $355,000 in the supplies and equipment budget to assist students with special education needs. 7 new Gaines classrooms will be opened in 22-23, located at Dougal, David Suzuki, Essex Public School, Legacy Oak Trail, Queen Elizabeth Public School, Southwood, and Westgate. As well, there will be 3 new STEPS classrooms implemented in September. 2 are being added at Riverside Secondary School and 1 at Westview Freedom Academy. And there's also $1.5 million of tutoring supports to address learning recovery associated with COVID-19. With respect to engaging our communities, the board continues its investments to continuously improve its social media and its website presence, as well as making refinements to the board's website as required. There are also investments in the area of Indigenous education, diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as dismantling anti-Black racism, and we'll talk about that in a couple more slides. We also continue to refine the 22-23 budget process, as I've alluded to earlier, and we are committed to doing so in the next year as well. And we did hold a public budget consultation presentation at the end of March for our community partners. With respect to ethical stewardship, the board has set aside $100,000 for renaming or rebranding schools as required. We also have a commitment for the development of a climate action plan and commitment to ensuring that the use of board resources is done so in an environmentally sustainable manner. As well, we have a balanced budget that we are presenting to you this evening, and we do have a healthy accumulated surplus, as Mr. Mayu just showed on some earlier slides, to address unanticipated expenditures. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is a very important initiative to this board. And as you know, back in May of 2022, the board did release its report and action plan for dismantling anti-Black racism. And the budget reflects the importance of this work with the investments that are noted on this slide. So for example, additional investments that are included in the 22-23 budget over the prior year's budget. There's the addition of 1 FTE graduation coach, so that we now have a total of 5. There are 2 FTE additions for Create Your Future advisors, which now results in a total of 4 for the board. And then we have put aside in a director's contingency of $500,000, and that will be used for an employment equity systems review, student census, a review of police programs in schools, as well as all the professional development training for all the staff at the board. Other initiatives related to, or other investments related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, compared again to last year's budget, is the Human Rights and System Equity Advisor position, which has been added and is now part of the senior administration team. There's 1 FTE for an equity teacher consultant, 1 FTE for LGBTQS plus social worker, and 1 FTE for an Indigenous graduation coach. If you exclude the director's contingency, there's $1.1 million that's included in the 22-23 budget for diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. As we've heard through our own experiences here as the senior team and through the public budget consultation, student mental health is a concern for for the board, and it is a key initiative in this budget. So I've mentioned some of these supports before, but I'll just reiterate the fact that we do recognize the importance of this and the impact that the COVID-19 pandemic has had on our students. And so as you can see on this slide, many of these items I've just mentioned as part of creating student well-being as part of our strategic priorities. But again, these same supports are available to our students with their mental health. The feedback from our community is vital for the board's budget development. In the public budget consultation survey, the community, represented by students, staff, parents, childcare centers, and other community partners, identified 5 areas where they felt that there was insufficient funding being allocated. So on the next 2 slides, we've tried to highlight how the budget does address those specific areas. So again, with student mental health and well-being, as well as staff mental health, that is on the left-hand side of the slide. Many of those items I've already just spoken to, but I just wanted to mention too as well, we do continue with funding for our employee assistance program for our staff. A mental health and resiliency policy was also developed and will be implemented in the fall. And there's a total of $4.8 million that's included in the budget for student and staff mental health and well-being. With respect to arts, which was also mentioned by the public, the programming budget has been increased by approximately $200,000 to allow additional resources for school. And as in total, there's $3.8 million, of which a portion of that would flow for supporting the arts. Technology resources, again, was something that was identified by the public. We do have a teacher laptop program. Wireless access points have been installed in every classroom so that there's more reliable connectivity and access to online resources. We had launched a new board website in 2022. There are lab upgrades and remote lab pilot programming that's going to be occurring in the next school year. Virtual learners have all been equipped. We are working on privacy and security improvements for our end users. There's going to be investments in broadband, and in total, this budget supports $6.2 million for information technology for 22-23. And with respect to outdoor education, I had mentioned there is $308,000 that's included in the budget for a variety of outdoor education programming. $315,000 is also provided to support athletic programming, transportation, and outdoor athletic events. And as I indicated earlier, there's $3.8 million that's being available to schools, which again can be used in part to support outdoor education as well. And with that, I will ask Sean to speak to the funding allocation.
Okay, this section will review significant changes in funding year over year. As mentioned previously, the operating budget and capital budget are balanced, and there's a drawdown of $999,000 of unsupported capital. This slide provides an overview of the board's share of each element of the GSN. We will review the details and changes in each area in subsequent slides. $442 million in GSN is grouped into these 4 areas here on the slide: spec ed, schools, classrooms, and local system needs. So the People Foundation grant is increasing $1.7 million. That's made up of a few different components. I've gotten a few questions about this, so I'll try and clarify what's happening here in this $1.7 million. Throughout the salary benchmarks in the GSN, a provision of 1% has been included for increases in salary benchmarks, and that's excluding the director and senior administrative staff. This funding is directly offset by an increase in expenses for salary. The online and in-person learning credit load, I'll try and explain. I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead here. A portion of this increase actually is net. There's a decrease included. Beginning with students who entered grade 9 in 2020-21 school year, all students must earn at least 2 online learning credits as part of the requirements for an OSSD. unless they have opted out or been exempted. In 21-22, the ministry changed the funding methodology for online courses by adjusting the benchmarks funding for classroom staffing. Since the online courses have higher class size requirements, they have a 30-to-1 class size requirement compared to 23-to-1 for in-person, the ministry is reducing the funding for teachers within this benchmark because less teachers are essentially required at the higher average rates. So as a result of those benchmark changes, there's a reduction in funding in the pupil foundation grant of approximately $200,000. So this 1.7 includes that reduction. And of course, it's an increase because we have the 1% and other items affecting the change. There's a new component of the pupil foundation grants for broadband network operations, and it's funded at $19.34 per pupil. Boards are to receive a minimum amount of $125. Since we exceed that minimum amount, the total amount flows through the pupil foundation grant, and our board will receive a total of $689,000 of additional funding for broadband network operations. And I just wanted to point out, this is kind of a good example of, we've had a few questions too about, there's a lot of sustainability issues perhaps, where we see a big deficit, for example, in spec ed. We see increasing costs with respect to the inflation and stuff like this. This is an example of, we've got extra money in the pupil foundation grant for network broadband network operations. Our board throughout the past many years has already taken on those initiatives. So we didn't need to go throw in an additional $700,000 in expenses in our IT budget compared to the prior year. So we have the benefit now of taking this and reallocate it to other priorities. So that's an example of where we draw upon areas in the GSN to help out the areas that don't have sufficient funding. There's an increase in the school foundation grant of $500,000. The funded salary benchmarks for principals and vice principals are being unified for the elementary and secondary panels. And they're also unifying the funded school office support staff salary benchmarks for elementary, secondary, and combined schools. What that means is they used to give us different rates for elementary and secondary. They've unified the rates, and that was an advantage to us. And also included in this grant is the 1% increase in salaries for benchmarks. There's an increase in special purpose grants of $100,000 essentially in the special education area. Funding is being provided through the special equipment amount or C amount allocation to support more assistive technology for students with special needs. The C per pupil amount component, the base funding is increasing to $20,000, previously $10,000. And the amount per pupil is increasing to $39.46 compared to $36.10 in the prior year, representing additional funding of $129,000 for spec ed. So you can see why we have a special education problem when the funding is only increasing that much. Also included in this allocation is a new local special education priorities amount of $259,000. However, that's not really an increase because it's being reclassified from a PPF that it was in last year. So it's just kind of a move in the GSN, movement into the GSN. There's an increase of $900,000. The ministry's providing 5.45% cost update to the non-staff portion of school operations allocation benchmark. That consists of two components: 2.3% cost update to assist school boards with managing increases in commodity prices, and a 3.15% cost update to support the increased costs related to the need to run ventilation systems longer and replace filters more frequently. So again, that was funding that was provided last year through a PPF. They moved that component into the GSN and said, we're giving you, 5.45% more. It looks a little bit better when in reality it's really, we're only seeing that increase of 2.3% year over year. Less funding is available through the declining enrollment adjustment. Declining enrollment adjustment provides school boards with transitional support, recognizing it takes time for school boards to adjust their cost structures to reflect declines in enrollment. Included in the budget this year is $753,000 of DEA funding. It was $1.6 million in the 21-22 year. So you'll see in the second year of decline, there's less funding available. That funding drops off. Next year, if we don't see a decline or we see flat enrollment again, we'll lose the current year, the $753,000. An increase in funding is being provided through the Supporting Student Mental Health Allocation to recognize the importance of promoting positive mental health considering the COVID-19 pandemic. The Student Mental Health Allocation base funding amount is increasing to $301,723 per school board. It was previously $100,858, and the per pupil amount's increasing to $6.67, previously $1.34. For 22-23, this allocation is enveloped, meaning that it must be utilized for school or school-based mental health staffing programs and initiatives. Also, a new investment is being provided for evidence-based mental health programs and resources to support student resilience and mental well-being. In total, the board will receive $615,000 more through the mental health and well-being grant, but that's offset by funding that was moved from a PPF into the GSN again by 190, so we only see an increase of 400,000. The ministry is providing the board with $5.2 million in one-time limited and temporary additional staffing supports to continue to hire teachers, ECEs, EAs, and other education workers to address learning recovery, the implementation of the first year of fully de-streamed grade 9, the delivery of remote learning supports for special education, and maintaining enhanced cleaning standards. As part of this grant, school boards will be required to provide the option for remote learning in 22-23. This support aims to meeting staffing needs for school boards so that schools can deliver stability for students and families. Again, this is time-limited funding. We don't know if it will continue in 23-24. And it does replace, again, PPF support that we received in the prior year. If you recall, in the prior year, we budgeted for 50% of all COVID supports that were announced at the time, and then we were waiting on the ministry in the fall to give us the go-ahead to use the other 50%. So this is the full amount of the staffing component that was in the COVID PPF in the prior year. So we had $2.6 million budgeted in the prior year. We now have 5.2. It looks like an increase. It really isn't an increase. And this slide chart shows the change in priorities and partnership fund grants. So this is the increase or decrease year over year. It's increasing by $2.1 million. Again, a little confusing here or misleading because last year we had COVID supports only in at 50%. All supports are in at 100% this year. Actual funding may differ significantly from the board-by-board allocation when it's released. The PPF revenue is budgeted to increase $2.2 million, and included in that increase is $137,000 representing prior year PPFs that have been transferred to the GSN in 22-23. An amount of $1.7 million, $943,000 in the prior year has been budgeted as revenue representing funding from the Government of Canada under Jordan's principle for the recovery of salaries and benefits paid to educational assistants who provide direct support for to Indigenous students. So in total, as mentioned, we have 35 staff in the budget this year compared to 19 last year. And here's just a laundry list of other funding considerations. I won't go through them all in detail. I mentioned the 1% increase in salary benchmarks offset by expenses. This is the 11th of a 12-year phase out of retirement gratuities, fourth year of a 5-year phase in of supplementary area factor impacts. The supports for students fund is continuing for this year. That provided 42.5 positions in the board budget, and it continues to provide that and is subject to the collective agreements or collective bargaining that will commence next year. Yep.
I just want to add too, with transportation, right now it's a $1 million deficit for transportation. Costs are increasing because of fuel prices. wage rates for drivers, inflation. The ministry is looking at the funding for transportation. They're apparently going to be increasing it a little bit, but our allocation has not been provided to us. So but the way the budget is written right now, it reflects the actual costs and only the announced funding, which results in $1 million deficit for transportation.
So this is an area of opportunity I did want to discuss. What the ministry has been doing is they've been maintaining our transportation funding in line with our actual expenses incurred during this review process. However, since we haven't reported our 21-22 actual expenses yet, we haven't adjusted to that funding level. So we're hopeful that in the revised estimates, we'll see that gap be funded. They've also announced that at a bare minimum, they're going to increase the benchmarks in transportation by 2%, but they just decided to keep that out of the funding formula for now. I don't know why. So again, here's some areas of opportunity where we could pick up some moving into the revised budget. In the 21-22 budget, a total of $3.9 million of PPF was included for COVID-19 supports, as announced by the ministry. That represented 50% of the supports at that time. For 22-23, these supports have been redistributed throughout the funding formula and/or discontinued, and the following table summarizes these changes. So again, budget to budget, it looks like something positive is happening here, where in reality, if you take the 3.9, you multiply it by 2, because that's the amount we include in the revised budget, we're actually going down in this area. And now we'll go into a deep dive of the operating expenses, which we'll talk a lot about the details in the appendices, which are at the back of your memo. This pie chart breaks down expenses into categories, and you'll see again, consistent with prior years, approximately 80% of the budget represents salaries and benefits, which once you account for other expenses which are necessary, such as amortization and utilities, it doesn't leave a lot remaining for other areas. Staffing, as I mentioned, because it represents 80% of the budget, I think it's vital to understand the changes in staffing year over year, as that's driving a significant portion of the change in expenses. I also want to note that these changes represents positions and not necessarily headcount. These changes are a change in full-time equivalent. So for example, there may be 2 half or part-time staff members that represent 1 FTE. So we're budgeting a decrease of 6.1 teachers, a decrease of 5 in the elementary panel, and a decrease in 1.1 in secondary, and that's attributable to changes in enrollment and meeting class size requirements. ECEs are budgeted to increase 3 as a result of meeting class size requirements. FDK class sizes of 16 students or more require an ECE. There was a couple questions about this because there's a blurb in the memo talking about how ECEs are funded. That section in the memo about how ECEs are funded relates to qualifications and experience funding only for ECEs. So we report them at the top of the ministry grid to ensure that we are funded at the level that we're paying the ECEs at. But as far as staffing ECEs go, that change is directly related to meeting class size requirements. Sorry. An increase of 64.5 EAs are budgeted. Of these positions, 16.5 are funded by Jordan's principals funding. And during the 21-22 school year, 23 FTE EAs were added to meet student needs. For 22-23, 7 new Gains classrooms and 3 new STEPS classrooms are scheduled to open. The number of students with needs and complexity of those needs continues to increase despite declining enrollment. We did have a question, also I'll address it right now with respect to enrollment, special education enrollment. In the 21-22 school year, we had approximately 306 additional students come into the system with complex needs. There are 208 approximate students coming into the system for 22-23, so for the upcoming year with complex needs. So a significant portion of those students have autism needs. If student enrollment is similar year over year, but there's a greater proportion of the student population who require special education services, then that's where we end up with the significant shortfall in funding. And just as an example, the 10 additional classrooms that are being opened up, the Gains and Steps classrooms, those aren't funded. We don't receive funding in the GSN that says here's additional funding for a classroom. It doesn't happen like that. We're funded on a per pupil. So per pupil, they don't consider whether the pupil has a special education needs or not. So those 10 classrooms that are opened up that require a minimum of 3 staffing supports in those classrooms each are not funded. Sorry, give me a sec here. Okay, there's an increase of 16.5 professional and other staff. We've gone through quite a few of these. I'll just highlight them quickly. There's a decrease in 2 re-engagement counselors budgeted as COVID support funding for re-engagement is discontinued in 22-23. There's an increase in 9 DSWs and 1 CYW to support the new Gains and Steps programs. There's an increase in 3 support workers to the deaf and hard of hearing. These positions are staffed directly to meet individual student needs identified. There's an increase in 3 ABAs, Applied Behavior Analysts, facilitators. 2 of those is a budget correction. We had the budget in there for salary. We did not have the FTE in there. And an additional 1 is supported with the student mental health allocation. There's an increase of 1 social worker to supported with the student mental health allocation, an additional of 1 social worker dedicated to LGBTQ2SL plus equity and inclusion programs. A behavior analyst is added to the 22-23 budget to support student mental health. There is a decrease of 0.5 FTE joint employee assistance program coordinator due to attrition. And I'm sorry, I think I jumped ahead here. Yep, I'm sorry, okay. And this line also includes a reclassification of 1 FTE Human Rights and Equity System Advisor to the Board Administration and Governance line. It was a reclassification. In the consultants line, 3 consultants have been added budget to budget. There's an Indigenous graduation coach added, an equity consultant added, and a well-being teacher added to this line. The decrease of 2 principals is a result of the consolidation of Eastwood Public School and Parkview Public School into Eastview Horizon, and General Amherst High School and Western Secondary School into North Star High School. There's a decrease of 1 FTE secondary vice principal, including the budget due to the consolidation of General Amherst High School and Western. There's a decrease of 2 secretaries as a result of the 2 school consolidations that I mentioned previously, and a decrease of 0.5 that is a budget correction to align with the investment in system priorities. There's a decrease of 4 staff in facility services, representing a decrease of 3 custodians due to the closure of Prince Andrew Public School and the consolidation of General Amherst High School and Western Secondary School into North Star High School. And there's also a decrease of 1 preventative maintenance position due to attrition, and that was to align staffing into quadrants. We put the schools into 4 quadrants and changed the service delivery model of PMs for those quadrants. So that position was not required. There's an increase of 3 board administrative positions. That represents the transfer of 1 FT, which is the Human Rights and Equity System Advisor, from the professional and other educational support line. There's the increase of 1 junior buyer position on contract until August 31st, 2023 to assist with the increased capital purchasing needs. And there's an increase of 1 FT to correct the budget and align actual FT with budget. And again, those are, whenever I say there's a correction, the wages were in there, we're aligning the FT with actuals. So we've typically put in extra funds for a specific position, and there just might have been an FTE reporting error that we need to specify to ensure that the benefits flow properly. In the other professional line, an increase of 1.5 represents employment service positions, which are fully funded by the Ministry of Labor, Training and Skills Development and related programs. So we'll briefly go through the appendices now. I won't speak much about staffing because we went into great detail about that, but I'll just highlight some of the major changes in your appendices. Appendix 6, and your appendices are right at the back of the memo there. We separated this year by a little kind of colored page there to make it easier for you to flip back and forth. So if you want to look at those while we're going through this, feel free to. This is the change in the teachers line. Again, this includes the 1% increase to salary benchmarks. It also includes the change in grid placement on the grids for teachers. So as teachers, we've assumed that the collective agreements are maintained still and that teachers will move on the grids effective September 1st, 2020. Included in this budget are 17 teachers that are supported by the Support for Students Fund. The occasional teacher cost of $8.7 million is budgeted to be consistent with the prior year. It's assumed that 22-23 will be more reflective of a regular school year, knock on wood, and this is a risk as previously mentioned. Appendix 7 includes the following staffing changes, which is a net increase of 85.5 positions. I won't go into detail. They're listed there for you. We've talked about a lot of those changes in their respective as an overall change in FTE, but this is the staffing changes in this specific section. This is page 1 of 2 of Appendix 7. I'll flip to page 2. Total costs in this area have increased $4.5 million. Primarily attributable to those staffing changes that we just showed in the chart, an increased costs and benefits, and an increase in salary grids and benchmarks. Note the part-time school aids amount has been maintained in the budget at previous year levels. Again, the last couple of years haven't been representative of actual part-time school aid costs. Assuming a regular school year, we'd expect to be more in line with that. I know over the last couple of years we've had savings in that line in particular, but we're maintaining the level of support there moving forward. A significant portion of the increases in this area relate to special education supports. The special education draft budget was presented to SEAC on June 14th and is included in section 4 of your budget binder. It reviews the specific funding and expenses as they relate to special education. In total, the special education deficit within the 22-23 budget is calculated at approximately $9.1 million. This means that non-envelope portions of the GSN are used to cover this difference. While this presents an ongoing budgetary challenge, it's not uncommon that school boards are facing increased pressure in this area of special education, and I believe pretty much all boards incur a deficit in this area, perhaps not this large, but they all struggle with this area. Appendix 8 reviews textbook and supply expenses. Just some quick highlights on some changes here. An amount of $290,000 consistent with the prior year has been budgeted for board initiatives to be determined by the director. This, in the past, this has been used to support initiatives such as Lexia and Power programs. And this, again, this money just provides some flexibility to address unexpected expenditures. In the curriculum and learning materials line, there's funding to support additional costs of the FSL initiatives, French as a second language initiatives and activities undertaken by English language school boards. This was a movement, again, of PPF into the GSN line, and we've just budgeted for the corresponding portion that relates to supplies. So you'll see that's increased by $23,000. The Pathways to Success line has increased $10,000 to match an increase in the enveloped funding provided through the Learning Opportunities Grant. The Parent Involvement line, again, there's the Parent Reaching Out grant, which was previously a PPF, and that's been moved into the GSN, and we've matched the expenses to equal the GSN amount, and you'll see that line's increased $36,000. School accommodation transition cost, there's a budget of $100,000 that's included for the school naming and mascot review. That's offset by additional savings of $20,000 in other budgeted line items. So you'll see that that line's increased $80,000. School support, the total school support budget has increased by $222,000 to a total of $1.9 million for 22-23. Funding for the well-being and mental health bundle is moving from a PPF into the GSN. And again, we've included expenses to match that as what is related to supplies, and that's $51,000. $157,000 has been added to this line to match funding received under the Rural Northern Education Fund. Again, that's just a budget correction year over year. Specialist high skills major and experimental learning program expenses have been increased $14,000 and $1,000 respective to match envelope funding in the areas. There's an increase of $355,000 in special education, and that represents a reallocation of salaries and benefits previously charged to C that are reallocated to the special education grant. Special funding requests and emerging issues. This budget's been reduced by $2 million, and that represents the director's contingency, as many of the emerging issues identified in the prior year have been captured throughout other areas of the budget. So we took back that contingency and reallocated it across all the additional supports that have been hired and all the additional budgets. There's decreases in safe schools, safety patrols, school information technology, and school reunion lines amounting to about $40,000 that we've just identified as budget savings year over year. And you'll notice again, there's no changes to the school allocation budgets. We're maintaining the total level of funding that we allocate to schools for instructional supplies year over year. The staff development includes expenses for new teacher induction grants, school effectiveness framework, and special education staff development. An increase of $89,000 is budgeted and primarily represents an increase in NTIP, which is offset by an increase in funding as more teachers qualify for this funding compared to the prior year. Funding is based on teachers with 2 years less of experience. Appendix 9 summarizes the cost for principals, vice principals, and school secretaries and teacher consultants. These lines reflect the impact of staffing changes we spoke about, the increase of 2 principals, decrease of 1 VP, decrease of 2 secretaries for the consolidations, the increase of 3 consultants. There's a provision for a 1% increase in salaries, and overall you see the total expenses increase $400,000 in this line. Total costs in this area have been budgeted to remain consistent with the prior year. Just some notable changes. I'll mention there still remains a professional development line of $4,000 per trustee and $3,000 for each student trustee. That's consistent year over year. Director and supervisory officer line, the retirement benefits of $63,000 have been reclassified to board administration based on a realignment of expenses with actuarial reports. Salaries continue to be frozen at the current rates until the ministry guidance is provided. And again, board administration includes the impact of staffing adjustments, the junior buyer, the reclassification of the human rights and equity system advisor, and the decrease of 0.5 joint employee assistant program coordinator due to attrition. And again, those have all been increased by 1% to account for the provision, the funding provision for salaries benchmarks. Appendix 10 presents the school facility expenses, essentially the cost to operate and maintain our buildings. This includes the decrease of the 3 custodians, the decrease of the 1 preventative maintenance position, increases in grids and grid positions, an increase in utilities expenses of $166,000 is included in this line. Decreases in benefits by approximately $295,000, which primarily relates to a decrease in projected WSIB expenses based again on our actuarial estimates. And you'll see the interest is going down on our debentures year over year as we continue to pay off those debentures. This represents the operating portion of total renewal funding, and the remainder is included in the capital budget. It's consistent year over year. Again, you'll see the increase in transportation expenses that we've talked about of $1 million due to increased carrier and routing costs. It's not funded right now. We hope that it will be. And this line, Appendix 11, also shows the change in the adult continuing education and summer school program, and any changes is typically offset by additional grants in those areas. Appendix 12 represents the budget for employment services. An increase in expenses equal to an increase in projected grants funding from other ministries, again, to support offices in Windsor and Leamington. Appendix 2 provides a summary of other grant revenue and expenses, or non-GSN funding. We've talked about all the significant changes in the PPFs that are being provided. PPFs are budgeted based on announced funding at the time of budget prep. There's some additional priorities funding which board by board allocations have not been announced. That additional funding, if it's announced, will be included in the revised budget. You'll see COVID-19 PPF supports are discontinued. That's one of the big changes on this line. You'll see that FSL, Learning and Innovation Fund, Parents Reaching Out grants, and Wellbeing and Mental Health bundles are all going to zero. They've all been transferred into the GSN. The miscellaneous revenue and discounts line includes a budget of $9,000 for discounts revenue, $9,500 for international student application fees, $487,000 for various solar and energy rebates, $500,000 of interest revenue, and $74,000 for other miscellaneous income, and $1.8 million for funding under Jordan's principle to fund the 35 EAs. This brings it all together, shows you the total operating expenses, the corresponding ministry compliance adjustments, and the overall operating budget, I guess, of $486.6 million. I will mention, too, we talked a bit about the employee future benefit adjustments, and we mentioned that one component of that is in its last year. So next year, this is an opportunity area, or a good news item, will free up approximately $3 million of compliance adjustment, which will be very much needed. Again, this is just the continuity of our accumulated surplus. That's included in the appendix. I won't go through this. We have already reviewed the accumulated surplus in detail. And I'll turn it over to Superintendent Armstrong.
Thank you. I just wanted to take a couple minutes just to go over a couple slides with respect to the capital budget. Next slide, please. Nice. So our capital funding consists primarily of funding for school renewal, and we get school condition improvement funding and school renewal allocation for that. Those amounts remain relatively unchanged from what we've received in prior years. We also get the school operations allocation, which is the funding we use to actually operate the schools, and we talked about the 2.3% that we get for the inflationary factor. We also receive temporary accommodation allocations, which we would use, for example, for portables. And then, of course, there are capital priorities, which really are outside of this budget, but where we do business cases to the ministry to support new schools or additions to schools. The capital items that are presented in this budget are fully funded. Past projects that are supported but where no funding received, and we've talked about these in the past: LaSalle Public School, Better Schools Energy Retrofit, and then there's debenture interest that was paid from renewal and GSN funding. And these projects will be fully funded with accumulated surplus effective August 31st. Amortization is also used to reduce the committed capital reserve that was set aside to pay off the capital deficit. In terms of significant capital priorities, again, I think we're all very familiar with this list. So we've been very fortunate in terms of the funding that we have received from the ministry. So I won't add anything further regarding that. And basically, we have a balanced capital budget for 22-23 of $72.0 million. And you can see the various categories that are reflected on the schedule: the renewal funding, the capital priorities that we discussed, and then there's funding for other various items, for example, full-day kindergarten, childcare, temporary accommodations, and so forth. Now, I know there's been a comment, we've had a few questions with respect to temporary accommodations. That funding has gone down significantly over the prior year. We don't know, we don't necessarily get explanations when we get the allocations from the ministry. I suspect a portion has to deal with the fact that we have received capital priority funding to build new schools and additions. What's important to note is the temporary accommodation funding can be used to repair existing portables. We cannot use that funding for any net new increases of portable inventory for the board. So should we require a new portable, we have to find the money somewhere else. It's just for repair of existing portables. So I just wanted to clarify that. Sorry, with that, we're happy to answer questions. And we do acknowledge the questions trustees gave to us, and thank you for that. We've generally answered them very quickly, and we will circulate all the questions and the answers to all the trustees.
Thank you, Superintendent Armstrong, and also Mr. Mayhew for that comprehensive presentation. So before I open it up to questions and discussion, I need a mover for item H1, I believe it was. And I see Trustee Sartori and seconded by Trustee Burgess. And so that is on the floor. And so that is the recommendation to approve the operating budget and capital budget as presented in your agenda. So I will start taking questions. So I saw Trustee Higgison, then Sartori, and then Leclerc. Go ahead, Trustee Higgison.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and through you to senior administration, particularly to Superintendent Armstrong, to Mr. Mayhew and the finance team. Thank you very much, not only for the binder that we got, but the context here. I think it's really important, and I know I've said this before at other meetings, and I just want to reiterate the point that it's great to see this kind of transparency and communication about something that's really complex. I know I've benefited from it sitting in this chair, so I can just imagine that the public seeing something that's kind of large and unwieldy as this. It's nice to be able to make some sense of it as you're sitting there wondering how your public dollars get spent. So I wanted to just start by saying that. Trustee Burgess and I were sitting here looking at each other while that presentation was going on and just thinking, man, it looks a little bleak. And I don't think that is understating it. I think it is understating it. It is a kind of a bleak picture about how investments in education are not only visibly lower, but not also aligning with the ministry's stated goals. So I looked on page 15 of our package where the ministry issues this 5-point action plan, and I'll just read them out. Measure and assess, strengthen numeracy and literacy skills, focus on student resilience and mental well-being, deliver comprehensive tutoring supports, and modernize education. Then on the flip side, they reduce COVID-19 support funding by $1.2 million. They give us time-limited and temporary support for teaching and support staff. And we're supposed to modernize education and close learning gaps and fund $9.1 million in spec ed and provide an online learning option, which isn't covered in here, nor is it funded in any way. This is a bit of a rhetorical question, but I'm wondering if you can give some context because it is a reality that we are sitting in. How are we supposed to support those investments necessary to maintain that all this year with less money? And is that something that we have any kind of control over increasing any of these investment pieces that are necessary to not only just support those, but increase the supports that we give to students for their well-being and their success?
I will turn that over to you, Superintendent Armstrong.
Wowzers. Okay, that's a lot. I don't even know how to answer this one. I think with the funding that we had, coming to a balanced budget with all of the, we've seen the needs in special education, we see the needs in mental health for our staff and students. We have our commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So to come to a balanced budget with the funding we have, knowing that we have all these other risks that are facing us was a feat in and of itself. So I'm pleased with that. Enrollment drives everything. So it really does. It drives the funding. So we've talked about that we're down 936 students from the beginning of 2018-19, from the pandemic till now. And while we might be, up 9, we're not back to where we were from 2 or 3 years ago. And that's a problem. So enrollment is a key factor. I think we just have to, I think we've done a good job focusing the money where the needs are. And part of it is just going to be very cautious in terms of how we spend. Inflation's a problem. We see with our new school constructions that's challenging too, to build to that. Advocating, just being, and it's tough because when 80% of your budget is salaries and benefits, it doesn't leave much left over to try and influence. I'm sorry, I don't know how else to answer that.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that. It is kind of an impossible thing to answer. I just wanted to put the point out there that, and I'm glad that you put it back to not only what we are doing for student well-being and student success, but also as a response to what we asked the community to tell us about where they see priorities. And so I am proud of what we are able to do with what we're getting. And so, and this is a little bit specific, but kind of related to that in terms of how we can advocate, or a potential way that we can advocate from our political roles. And it's specifically mentioned, or we talked about spec ed and this $9.1 million unfunded cost. Have there been, at a ministry level, any discussions? Mr. Mayhew mentioned that other boards are sitting in this position too, perhaps not at $9.1 million, but somewhere in that other boards are looking at that. Have there been discussions at the ministry level about properly funding that in a GSN, about moving those costs to something that is actually reflective of reality? Not just reality now, but we're hearing about all the increases of students that are coming in, and all the complex needs that are happening to and with our families that are certainly not decreasing. They're getting higher. And have there been any discussions at the ministry level about moving those actual costs into supports for GSN, or is that a political role that we play to insist upon that?
Sure, go ahead, Director Kelly.
It's my pleasure to answer that question. Yeah, I do think you could play a critical role through you, Madam Chair, in terms of advocating. This is, a bit alarming to see this kind of a deficit, and we're not obviously funded the way we should be. To be fair, we did have an adjustment in special education funding 4 or 5 years ago that did assist this board, but it clearly isn't adequate enough. And I think in our board we do a great job of welcoming all and making sure we support students across the system. And so that poses a real challenge. And so any political advocacy in that way, certainly discussions amongst SBOs, directors, certainly from the staff side of it, but I think anything in that way can really help.
Thank you. I'll now go to Trustee Sartori.
Thank you. Trustee Higgison, you're a tough act to follow after those comments. No, it was an excellent synopsis, so thank you. And I want to echo your comments as well, and yours too, Superintendent Armstrong, that given all of the limitations, what was accomplished in this budget for 2022-23 is truly a feat, which needs to be recognized. So thank you. You mentioned declining enrollment, and I'm not sure. I'm hoping you were able to see the questions that I sent in at 3:15, 3 hours after the deadline. But my question isn't super specific. It's really about mitigation strategies, right? So I'm looking at the declining enrollment and its impact on our budget, not only, and our revenue, obviously, not only in the 22-23 year, but on an ongoing basis. And I'm also looking at the declining enrollment fund as well, which apparently is going to literally be going away after the next year is my understanding. So, and in fact, it was cut in half this year. So I'm curious about mitigation strategies going forward. And I'm also wondering, and I'm going to preface this by saying I don't want this, but I'm also wondering if there is talk that you're hearing at all about lifting the moratorium on parks.
I can get the first part of that question through you, Madam Chair. Absolutely, time-limited funding, definitely a concern and a risk to future budget years beyond, I guess, 22-23. Declining enrollment, one aspect of that. There's the COVID-19 Recovery Learning Fund, which I believe $5.2 million, which they've said is time-limited. That might go away next year, in 23-24, don't know. The $700,000 we're receiving in declining enrollment grant adjustment, that might go away next year. The recent immigration supplement that they've continued might go away next year. That's a couple $1 million. Those are all areas that we've kind of highlighted in the budget as being time limited. Don't know what's going to happen. It seems like they were maintained, perhaps for political purposes with an election. So I'm not sure if that could go away now that there's no election on the horizon. We're keeping a close eye on that. We're also keeping a close eye on opportunities that might help offset that, such as enrollment. We did provide a conservative estimate for enrollment. We're very hopeful that over the summer we pick up some of those students that were lost. I think restrictions are going away. Families are feeling more comfortable sending students back to school. We hope that there was some delayed, deferred registrations that were not captured. That could provide an increase in our funding. We're hopeful that transportation gap will be closed come revised estimates. That could be $1 million of additional funding in transportation. We're hopeful that some of the priorities that are identified that haven't been allocated board by board will help address some of the concerns that you've mentioned so far, where we could redirect our budgets that we have existing to help offset that. And we're also hopeful, I guess, that the last point I wanted to make was, I lost my train of thought there. Give me a moment. There was one other area. The employee future benefits. We're in our last year of amortization on the one of them. So we've fully funded the one area. That's about $3 million. So that will, in 23-24, we will not be required to have a $3 million compliance adjustment, which we've always had to reserve for in our budget. So while there's a lot of time-limited stuff going on, there's also some opportunity. We're hoping that kind of comes together, offsets, and we're allowed to maintain our investments in our budget as a result. And if not, we're going to have to go back to the drawing board. We're going to have to reevaluate all our budgets in each area, and we're going to have to make some difficult decisions and perhaps even consider if we get into the position where we have to potentially use a portion of the 1% of our accumulated surplus in the short term to allow us some time to align our cost structures, then that's a consideration. So we have that flexibility right now.
Thank you. Go ahead, Director Kelly.
Yeah, thank you. Through you, Madam Chair. The question about the moratorium is that going to be lifted around accommodation reviews? I have not heard that there's any change to that, and though we regularly ask, but there certainly hasn't been any change to that decision-making at this time.
Okay, thank you.
No supplemental?
All good for now.
Okay, I'll go to you, Trustee Leclerc.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I'm going to piggyback on our chair's initial comments because I wrote all this stuff out and I'm going to say it, but I also have a question that I'll follow. So I'm going to support this budget. reservedly, not because of the work that our employees have done, because the work that they've put forward is remarkable. But I think the risk factors that we face are probably more significant in this budget than any of the budgets that myself, Trustee Sartori, Halberstadt, in our terms, and maybe even Trustee Burgess, but certainly. Okay, so at least for the three of us, I think this is one that's the most challenging in terms of the risk factors. You know, leaving us exposed for COVID in a manner that's not fair. We don't know where inflation is going because you know setting aside 1% for salaries, I think is it may be something that comes to fruition only because it's forced on unions because of some legislation. But is it realistic to expect our employees to get a 1% increase when inflation is going to be 5 or 6%? I don't think it is. I'm also concerned about the risk factor related to our reserves. This would be the third year that we're reaching into our reserves. And again, going back to my time on the board, it was a struggle to get to the point where we're increasing our reserves and to reach in them because we're underfunded by the provincial government, again, is unfair. But my biggest concern is regarding the special education sector. A 3 times increase is certainly not sustainable out of our pocketbook. You know, the government's approach to the GSN is that children are standardized, and we know that they're not standardized. And I'm really concerned that this approach of not providing proper special education funding will result in marginalization of some of our students, and that really concerns me. So I do believe that as trustees, as directors, as OPSPA members, we have to advocate to improve the approach to the GSNs, to include a more wholesome and realistic reflection of what the reality is in our schools in Ontario, particularly our own board, but it's the same problem across the way. That's my commentary, but my question relates to you know, declining enrollment and what strategies we might have to re-engage international students in the next 12 months to attract them back to, because we were starting to really have traction in that area prior to the pandemic, and it's a real opportunity for us to, you know, increase a revenue stream that is driven by our own successes, right? So I'm just wondering where we're at with that.
Through you, Madam Chair, if I could, and I know that the Superintendent Corbeck may have responses to that. I do believe there is an increase in the international students for next year. In asking one of your staff the other day about that. But again, that is something we can certainly market. And again, as you recall, the ministry also took a chunk of that money for every one of our students away a year or two ago as well. $1,300 or something was taken from there. We do, of course, have to get our homeschool students back. There's a number of other things that we're doing around re-engagement. But thank you for the reminder on that. And Superintendent Corbeck, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And through you, Madam Chair, actually was meeting today with one of our larger recruiters for international students. One of the sort of challenges that we're facing is that markets we used to rely on heavily are far more challenging for a variety of reasons, but one of them being COVID restrictions. So we really have to be creative and think of ways to target and get into other markets. So we have some strategies around that, looking at partial year international student placements, perhaps some shorter term international student placements, and ways to market the region to sort of international markets that we wouldn't historically have drawn students from.
Okay, thank you. No supplemental? Okay. Go ahead, Trustee Burgess.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I didn't hear anybody on the phone, so I think that's okay. I have several questions, and I'll wait in line for all of them. I do support the motion on the floor, because I can't think of any other way of managing this. Good Lord. Congratulations on all this work. I think there's been some really difficult decisions made, and I'm not all, completely happy with all of them, but I don't think being happy with it is necessarily the goal. It's what we can do. There's a lot of risks. I'm really concerned about the questions that no one in the room has any answers for. We've kind of gone through that for the last 2.5 years in some respect, but there were patterns emerging where we could sort of, make some, good guesses. But I'll just reiterate with my colleagues, I'm concerned about the enrollment not coming back because it's still a funding, the main funding, factor. So that concerns me. I appreciate the fact, thank you for giving me the ray of light, because I really, even when I read it, understanding that the retirement gratuity going away, that's good. The retrofit money that we took out to better schools, whatever, I remember that, like in the early 2000s, right? That's very nice to retire that and retire the debenture for LaSalle. And, there's little pockets of light sort of thing, but they're not going to make what the difference that we need. So I appreciate my colleagues' support about how we have to advocate on all fronts, because not one of us is going to manage this. We need more questions answered, and so my things are sort of not devil's advocate, but what if that doesn't happen? What do we have even in the realm of our thinking? If we don't get the $1 million for transportation, despite all the rumors and innuendo and everything else, what are we supposed to do? Like, we used to have the ugly list, the things that we'd cut and hold our nose and say, oh my gosh, I don't want to do that. If we don't get $1 million for transportation, where do we find $1 million?
Well, I think it's already, through you, Madam Chair, the deficit's already reflected in the balanced budget. So, we've
Correct.
accounted for that deficit like we have with special education already within the existing budget. But there's limited ways to cut when 80% of your budget is salaries and benefits. So it does become challenging. I do acknowledge that.
I have other questions,
Did you have a supplemental on this one, or Mr. Mayhew had
not
a-
regarding
Okay.
transportation. No, it's another thing.
Go ahead, Mr. Mayhew. if you
Just
have-
wanted
yeah.
to add to that quickly through Madam Chair. I think one of the areas heading into, I guess, revised budget is we don't have the benefit this year, perhaps, of dipping into 2% if we really needed to. They haven't rolled that forward, so we have the opportunity. We don't want to have to access 1%, up to 1% of our reserves for unexpected items that may arise. Should we not be able to adjust cost structures and we need to access additional expenses in the short term. So there's that flexibility, not something that I would advocate for, because you can see in 21-22 that we've budgeted for over an $8 million deficit. We're headed towards at least that 1%. It could be higher. We need to finalize our year end. We do have some COVID savings, but until the year's done and we know our current position, and then we have to internally appropriate another $3 million for Kingsville, you can see how those COVID savings back in the last couple of years during lockdowns and have really kind of started to go away now. So I wouldn't advocate as that being a permanent solution, but knowing we have flexibility to consider that moving forward. Because we have not presented a deficit position, we presented a balanced budget.
So just a supplemental comment, and that's great, but that's not sustainable.
No.
So that would be how I would encapsulate my worry, is that that's great, and we will get those revised budgets in the in-year, updates, et cetera, but I'm just wondering how you'd even, I'm sure there's going to be unbelievable flexibility between the revised estimates and the updates. I'm sure it's going to be self-evident. I'm just worried that way.
Thanks, Trustee Burgess. I'm going to go to my colleagues who haven't had their first round yet. of questions. Trustee Halberstadt and then Trustee Hatfield, did you want to be put in the queue as well?
Yes, please.
Okay, you can go after Trustee Halberstadt. Go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I spent a lot of time putting together questions. A number of them have been answered today already. But I do look forward to, I'm not going to go through all of the questions and complaints that we received, but I would definitely like to see responses later. I'm not going to do it all today. But there's a couple that I have, there's a couple questions that I have I would like to bring up today. One is to restrict how boards spend money to protect funding for capital and special education and limit spending on board administration. Where are the examples on admin spending limits? So that's one I'd like to maybe toss over to somebody.
I can start this one. Through you, Madam Chair, with respect to board administration and government expenses, we are in compliance. We're actually well under what has been allocated by the ministry, and I can say what's been allocated by the ministry is fairly lean. Board administration and government governance does not represent a significant portion of the budget. It's actually very low when benchmarked to other industries, to be honest with you. I don't know, Superintendent Armstrong, if you want to add to that.
No, not really. It's a compliance calculation by the ministry. In order to submit a compliant budget, we have to monitor and be within the ministry calculations for that, and we are.
Okay, I guess the other follow-up on that would be the number of top administrators that we have. I think we've added a couple. There's been an increase of 3. Maybe somebody can give me a rationale for that.
I can start through you, Madam Chair. I believe the 3 you're referring to are the one junior buyer position, which is actually a contract position, which is ending August 2023, and that was needed to get us through all the construction that is going on. The ministry, whenever they allocate you a lot of funds, and we've been a beneficiary school board of that, what they don't do is give you the additional resources you need to implement the spend of those funds. So we felt we needed to add in that area to accommodate that need. I believe the other position was a reallocation from another area. There was the human rights and equity advisor position that we moved from one line to another line, so it looks like an increase. It's just a reallocation within the budget. And I'm sorry, the last position. Thank you. It's a budget correction. There was one FT that was not counted in a formula. Their salary was and benefits were, but the FT number wasn't flowing over properly. So it was an update to the budget year over year.
Sure, go ahead, Director Kelly.
Yeah, if I could add to that through you, Madam Chair, your question about one of the positions was the Human Rights and Equity Advisor position. I do believe that, and I'm working on getting that funded through the Ministry of Education as that was promised last year, and so I've been in touch with the ADM, so that should, I hope, be funded. I can't guarantee that. I emailed, and the response was, I'm working on it. So I'm hoping that would be funded as well.
Thank you. Go ahead. Trustee Alberstadt, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wondered with the survey, survey report that we had, it was quite illuminating. But I wonder if, could admin quantify how many of the comments and questions have been used to inform changes? And I listed a lot of them, but I'll just send it off to administration to answer. But some of these comments are quite critical, and I'm just wondering what we're doing with that. Are we getting back to the people that are making all these criticisms? How much are we using of those criticisms to maybe improve our situation, our service, and how much is really not required?
Thanks. Go ahead, Superintendent Armstrong.
Thank you. Through you, Madam Chair. When we provided the information to trustees, we gave you literally all the comments so that we were transparent with what the public was saying. And when we did a presentation on that budget consultation survey and in conjunction with this budget, we did provide a summary of the top 5 areas that where individuals felt there was sufficient funding, the top 5 areas where they felt there was a gap in the funding. So we have focused on the more common items by focusing on the top 5. I do have your questions, though, Trustee Halberstadt, in terms of specific areas where you want to know how many people responded. And we can certainly look to doing that over the summer and providing that back to you. We'd have to do a search on certain key terms, and we can do that for you.
Okay, so after the summer, you'll be putting these out? And that would, I'm assuming, would also include questions from other trustees, right?
We'll do the questions that all the trustees have asked. We'll make sure that you get that in the next week. But yours specifically about the budget survey and the comments and how many times did someone say this particular phrase, we might need a little bit more time to focus on that one.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Can I just add to that very quickly? Through you, Madam Chair, I just wanted to say that as part of that exercise too, is important to draw out the themes from the public and provide the education piece too. I think what we found through some of the trends was that we weren't doing a good enough job explaining, for example, how we are spending money in IT. That's a perfect example. We every year we sit down and we go through the IT budget. We talk about all the projects. We talk about all the spending, how we're improving labs within schools, how we're going to fund this specific project, how we're going to build a new website, AODA, all this stuff. And I think that component's missing a bit from the public budget meeting. So when we receive feedback from the public that says, well, we don't believe there's sufficient funding for IT, it's a bit of a surprise because we think we're actually investing a lot in IT. I just don't think it's coming through that way. So we've tried to beef up those sections to explain where those expenses are in the budget, not just year over year budget changes. And I hope that we continue to do that to hopefully educate the public where those monies are being spent and on what priorities.
So some of these criticisms we're getting could be because the people are ill-informed, not because they're making stuff up, but they're ill-informed. But I think we should respond to that.
Thanks, Trustee Halberstadt. I think that, as Superintendent Armstrong noted, she'll try to get back to you on some of those specifics as well. So I will move on to Trustee Hatfield on the phone. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So I'm not going to repeat what all the previous trustees have said because I think we're all on the same page and we all share the same concerns. And I want to thank Superintendent Armstrong for responding so quickly to my questions that I sent in, which were all related to the areas of risk. And I think we have some serious concerns there. And I also think there's been some discussion already tonight about the enrollment situation. And trustees may recall that at the last board meeting, I did request the status of the Student Recruitment and Retention Committee, which I think is timely. And if it hasn't been continuing their mandate, that this might be a time to get that committee back up and running to address our enrollment concerns. But bottom line is, I know that we have to send in a budget that's in compliance with the ministry guidelines, but I've never been comfortable sending in a budget where we have such serious shortfalls in funding without a letter advocating on behalf of our school communities. And I think this year is no exception. Perhaps this year there is more urgent need in certain areas of our budget. Special education, very obvious. We went from approximately $3 million unfunded expenses last year to now over 9 million. That we just have to address that. And just another thing, I don't know if people picked up on this, but in the capital budget, we have standing out there in Netherlands is this $93 million that's been identified as urgent needs to upgrade our facilities. 93 million, and what we're getting is just over 5 million. And then we had identified 120 million as high priority needs, and with that we're getting 24 million. I mean, things are going to start falling apart if they aren't already, and we just can't, keep using Band-Aids. How can we identify capital needs as urgent or high priority? And I think we're being very realistic. I think that the evaluation was done very professionally, and yet there's no response to that from the ministry. So I'm recommending to the trustees that we send a very clear message with an attached letter to this budget about these particular risk items that are seriously underfunded through government formulas, through the ministry's formulas. Because I'm not just comfortable just sending in the budget the way it is. Do I need a motion to do that, to request that?
So Trustee Hatfield is requesting a letter to be sent alongside our budget. I believe that can be by consensus. I'm seeing most people shake their heads yes. And so just to be clear, it's a letter outlining the items that are clear concerns in our budget and that are currently underfunded, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
And I think that administration knows exactly what those areas are. They've clearly identified them in the risk section of the budget presentation. And I think the chair would have some input into that letter as well, because it would go under the signature of the chairperson of the board. And between administration and the chair, I think that they'll be able to capture our concerns.
Perfect. Thank you. That I think everyone agrees with that. And yes, we're all pretty clear on what those will be. So
Great.
With that, I will continue along our list. Trustee Higgison had a second round of questions. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Trustee Hatfield, for that. I think it's very important that we do that, and I agree that that there are a list of things, but our clear concern, I'm going to advocate that it be noted in there as well. So thank you for that. The question that I had was about PPF funding that we don't know about yet, and how that coincides with what we may not know, what we do not know about online learning. So online learning or a virtual school, pardon me, those are different. Online learning is separate from a virtual school. We are required to offer a virtual school option by the ministry for this year, and yet it is currently unfunded. We do, however, I noted in here that there are some PPF funds and allocations that are, or both streams and amounts that are still yet to be announced that we don't know are coming. It is true that we must have a virtual school option. We do not know what the enrollment of that will be, and so therefore what the cost of that may be. Do we have any indication from the ministry that a portion of any maybe of these outstanding PPF funds would go toward covering all or particular portions of a virtual school option that we are required to have? Is there any indication that that's a portion of those PPF funds that are coming?
Thank you, through Madam Chair. I'll start the answer, and then certainly Mr. Mayhew might want to jump in. In the budget, there is funding, 5.9 million called COVID-19 Learning Recovery. That funding covers a laundry list of items: de-streaming, enhanced cleaning, remote learning, supports for students. I mean, it's an enormous list. That is the only place where there's anything in reference to supporting a remote learning option in terms of funding. So that amount has to cover more than just a virtual school. So like as we've indicated, it's a risk. We don't know yet how many students will opt in for that. We're optimistic that, you know, students will want to return to school. We certainly believe that's the best place for students to be. We're not aware that any of the unannounced PPFs will relate to anything for COVID at all or remote learning.
Just add to that quickly through Madam Chair. I think too, it's already been determined that the physical location that hosted the virtual school last year, Prince Andrew, is closing. So any costs associated with Prince Andrew as a site for that won't continue. It's tough right now to determine the administrative costs or any additional costs staffing wise for a virtual school, because it's not yet been determined how many students are going to attend virtual school. And until we have that number, I don't believe estimates can really be made. So it would just kind of be but with that said, I would expect them to be significantly less than the prior year, just given that last year I think there was over 1,000 students in virtual learning, which required the need for a special site, specific administrative costs, and everything that comes with the operating a building. So
Thank you. I appreciate that. So I'm gathering from that it's not likely that any of this PPF funding will come for online learning or come for virtual learning, and yet we know that the COVID-19 supports are also supposed to fund learning gaps and modernizing education. So good luck to all of us. Thank you for that.
Thank you. I know that Trustee Burgess had a second round of questions, so I will go to her, but is anyone else wanting to be added to that list? Okay, go ahead, Trustee Burgess.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I appreciate the indulgence. I was kind of restricted and able to get my questions because I didn't receive the binder, and then I couldn't see the binder for a few days. So I appreciate your indulgence in trying to answer any of my questions. On page 58 of 92, so what would that be? It's part of the mental health programs. I was wondering, because another concern I have is that despite all the lists of emphasis on mental health for staff and students and families, you know, dedicated funding, enveloped funding, whatever. I'm not sure that even despite all the announcements and everything else, that what we have is going to be adequate, because I think the need is so great. And and I think we've all acknowledged in news and whatever, some of our earliest learners are arriving with things that, we just are kind of unprecedented, and it really is going to affect their learning and the classroom. And so it refers to something about evidence-based mental health programs and resources to support student resilience and mental well-being. And I'm wondering, because it looked like something new. So I was wondering what our new evidence-based mental health program is, or have we been successful in applying, or we think we can link something that we're already doing to a new kind of funding? I was wondering if what we have on deck for evidence-based mental health programs and resources. I mean, that's what we do anyway, but.
So I'll start, and then perhaps Superintendent Wilcox can might have something to add. Thank you for the question, through you, Madam Chair. So the ABA position and the BCBA position, as well as one of the additional social workers, are going to be aligned to a team that will work specifically with early years and specifically on strategies for improving self-regulation and addressing some of those concerns that we're seeing, as you spoke to, in terms of our earliest learners. So that is the plan. I don't know if Superintendent Wilcox wants to add anything, but that is what that is specifically. At least those three positions are specifically targeted at the K-3 group.
Sure. Just to add to that, it's kind of built on our Tier 3 teams that we have now that go and build staff capacity in classrooms. And so this group will go in and work on self-regulation, structured learning activities and resources for those classroom staff, and structured classroom environments as well. So that'll be something they'll be doing to go into, and that'll be their areas of focus as we helpfully build the capacity of our early years teams for some of our students that are coming in.
So I understand it's an augmentation of something that we're already doing and we're expanding it, that we have a level of expertise and we're expanding that capacity. Okay. Because I was wondering if it was something brand new that we haven't done already. Okay. I have another question. I'm concerned about the decrease in vice principal at North Star. My understanding has been that the additional support at Western and the additional support at Westview Freedom Academy, for example, where it's a school that has a consolidated campus of former campuses or whatever, and really augmented special education support for high school students, special courses, all of that, and also often a higher need for vice principal support. In an increased, a larger school than just regular General Amherst, is the expectation of enrollment from who would have normally been attending Western and now at North Star, is it going to be decreased? Is the need decreased? Is there? I see that inclusion is growing and growing and growing. I get that, but we have those programs, and it always seemed to me that an extra VP was prudent. It wasn't wasteful in any way. It was prudent in that environment. So could someone help me? Or was that just another tough decision?
Through you, Madam Chair. Yeah, it is another tough decision, Trustee Burgess. It is a school, I believe, of 800. Am I right on the numbers? Superintendent Houston isn't here, and she's just done staffing, which would be, not unreasonable to have a principal and a vice principal. We have this year, while there's been some transition, had a vice principal in at General Amherst a couple days a week to assist the principal, with some of the work that is going on now in terms of transitioning students. But that's something we'll continue to monitor. Again, for the size of the school, it would normally warrant that. But I do hear what you're saying in terms of the needs of the students and the combining and the transition that will be occurring there.
I just sounded as a warning because we did try it at Westview Freedom Academy, and it really wasn't terribly successful. And we reinstated. And I want to put that on note that if we're putting it in the letter, I think we're taking a bit of a risk on not only the workload, but the success of administration managing it, because it's not just 800 students, it's 800 students with really specific, some of them really specific and targeted, that usually require more time, and burnout is real, and we need to make sure that we service kids. So I just want to flag that. And I have a question for clarification as well. I just don't understand. In Appendix 7, there's a reference to the, it includes school technicians, includes TREVLAC support. Do we still support TREVLAC? What does that mean?
Through you, Madam Chair, I think that's just a terminology that didn't get changed to what we call now ASPEN.
Thanks, because I thought $2 million, including TREVLAC, like what? And I knew that wasn't, I knew there was something reasonable, I just couldn't figure it out. I did have another question, I think.
Trustee Burgess, you said you do have another question? Okay. I don't think anyone else has any questions at this time. You got one more comment. Okay, go ahead.
It's a comment, and I've made it before, and I'll just state it because we've had some discussion at regional meetings and different things about it, about how, language creeps in, and we keep referring to absenteeism. And absenteeism, in its strictest sense, generally sort of means a derogatory thing. And really what we're dealing with is absences and the cost. What did we call it? Because you obviously spoke about it in your presentation, but the regular risk replacement costs. And and if we say it, if we call it just absences or absences, absence replacement costs, then it frames it, I think, a bit more realistically, particularly in a labor year and particularly in a time when absences may be up for really legit reasons, you know, because you have to isolate, you have to be away, you have to tend to your mental health, you have to whatever. So I brought it up before, but when it's in a document, it kind of doubles down on the insinuation. So if it's possible, I'm not suggesting an amendment because I support the motion, but in for future reporting, if we could put that phrase as absences, I would, or something else than absenteeism. You can talk about absenteeism, but it's part of absences, regular absences, because I just think it's important to give that signal to our staff who are doing their very best.
Thanks, Trustee Burgess. Okay, any last round for questions or comments? Okay, seeing none. So I did have some questions and comments, but my colleagues did a really great job in, I think, narrowing in on the issues that that really mattered. One question that I did have was just really simply, year over year, from last year to this year, what is the total operating budget as a percentage larger? I didn't see that anywhere specifically, and it looks like to be between 2 to 5%, but I wasn't really able to capture that number from our appendices specifically, and I just wanted to know if that was there. It was in the one slide, I believe, but I didn't catch it enough to write it down. Oh, he is? Okay. Okay, thank you. Sure. Yeah, I just think that's a really important number that, you know, echoing a lot of the comments of my colleagues, knowing what that looks like with inflationary pressures, et cetera, what that really means for our board. Yes, yeah. Sorry, so just for the people on the phone, yeah. $4.1 million, and that's for our operating expenses. Okay. Has the funding gone up proportionally to that number? Or allocated funding? Budget, yeah, sorry, budget just for, or sorry, the microphone for Trustee Hatfield.
This is going to be a little bit misleading, okay? Because our operating revenue has gone up 1.8% year over year. If you recall last year, when we did budget, we would have budgeted for a deficit of $4.2 million. So the revenue has to go up higher than the expenses to account for that. And also, you have to take into consideration the COVID funding that was at 50% as opposed to 100% at revised estimates. So it's not a good comparison to look at it like that. But
So essentially, we budgeted for a deficit last year with the intention that we would have that money funded. But this year, we're balanced budget. So it looks like it's quite a bit more, but it's really because we were anticipating a lot of additional costs related to COVID.
yeah, so I would look at it from the operating expense standpoint. I would look at it what our total operating costs are relative to last year. You're right; they've gone up 0.9%. So budget to budget, it's not, you know, it's far less than the cost of inflation, let's say, and far less even than the 1% increase in wages and benefits alone. So.
Okay, thank you. I was trying to narrow that into what that would look like in terms of, I believe it would be a real-time deficit of around 5 to 6% is what it sounds like, but it sounds like it's even more than that based on what you're saying. But I think you're pointing to the fact that it'd be hard to do that comparison based on how we constructed our budget last year with COVID expenses. Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'll end with some final comments. I know that we've made a joke that since Superintendent Armstrong has started, that there's never really been a normal budget. They've either been long overdue or late, or we've been through a pandemic. And so this was the one that was going to start to feel a little bit more normal. In that, I think the only thing that's normal is that maybe we're back in person. But we are not the same as we were 2 years ago. There are new challenges that have arisen in education. I mean, virtual schooling being one of them for our board, but also specifically just a number of concerns that my colleagues have itemized today. So I want to echo those comments that there are major risks, inflationary risks at this point, unknown COVID expenses, enrollment decreases, another big thing that is not normal for our board over the last 2 years. And one thing that does feel a little normal is that we're entering a period of labor relations, but we are entering a period of labor negotiations with a lot of serious staffing concerns in terms of mental health, absences, and just the need to support our students differently than they have before. And so professional development in terms of diversity, equity and inclusion, mental health supports, et cetera. So I think plain and simple, I think my colleagues have pointed this out, that we are being asked to do more with less. We're being asked to do different things with less. And I think in a time when we need to be over-investing in education in our students, who have been through a lot over the last few years. And you know, one of the things that came to mind, and it's something really little, but it's something that is really, I think, symbolic. And I say little, it's on page 23 with the re-engaging students and reading assessment supports, around $350,000, which has been cut. And again, that's not a huge sum in the scope of our budget, but reading supports for our students right now seems really critical. And so I do echo the comments of my colleagues that there seems to be a disconnect between our priorities and the ministry priorities and what they're choosing to fund. And I think the biggest representation of that is our spec ed budget, and being in a deficit position of $9.1 million, and knowing that there are significant needs in our system that we're funding and we're doing, and you know, thankfully to our senior administration who are prioritizing the correct things in terms of equity and education. And so we are at the mercy of the province and this government right now in terms of what they are choosing to fund. And we don't have the ability to open purse strings and fund ourselves more, as much as I would like that in order to fund the needs of our system. And so I'm happy that by consensus we're able to send a letter to the ministry. It doesn't feel like enough in a time of these kind of grave concerns, but I think that it is the right approach. And so I implore our chair and also our OPSBA director of continuing that education advocacy at the provincial level. And so with that, I do want to thank our team. I really do appreciate the work that Superintendent Armstrong and Mr. Mayhew and Ms. Malash have done, mostly to connect the dots for people in our community in terms of transparency and just communication about where our money is actually being spent. I know that as a trustee, I've learned a lot over 4 years, but I think that's largely been due to the fact that we've really changed the way that we've engaged our community on this. And so I'm appreciative of that budget kind of perspective and the consultation pieces that we've been able to have as well. And to the finance team, to Director Kelly, to senior administration, this is not going to be easy, I think, over the next year. I think that, again, being asked to do more with less is challenging. And so I think we will do our best to advocate, and I do think it's also going to be a difficult year with labor negotiations in light of the inflationary pressures and salaries and wages just not keeping up with that. It's challenging, and education and supporting our staff is really critical, as they're the ones who support our students, and everyone is struggling right now as we're kind of re-engaging during this time. So I will not belabor the point, but I will just say thank you to everybody for their questions, for providing the information as clearly and succinctly as possible. And so with that, I will call the question on our motion. And unless there are any further comments, so I will call the question that the recommendation that the board approve an operating budget of $486,614,595 for the fiscal period of September 1st to August 31st, 2023, resulting in a surplus deficit for purposes of the Ministry of Education compliance calculation of nil, and that the board approve a capital budget of $72,049,062 for the fiscal year period September 1st to August 31st. I guess I'm calling the vote. Instead of doing any opposition, I will do all those in favor. And I
Support.
and I also support, and that carries unanimously. So thank you. So with that, I will adjourn this special meeting of the Operations and Finance Committee, and we'll convene a special board meeting, and I will pass it over to Chair Higgison. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for that. And thank you, trustees and senior administrators and staff for all their work that went into to that. I will call our meeting to order. Trustees, for our purposes, we are on the blue piece of paper at number 2 in your binders. I will call this special board meeting to order at 7:25. Attendance is the same as it was for our special meeting of Ops and Finance. Trustees Cook, Cheen, and Olmsted have sent regrets, and Trustee Hatfield is on the phone. Can I get approval of the agenda for this? Trustee Leclerc and Trustee Sartori, any discussion on the agenda as we see it in front of us? All in support of that agenda? Thank you so much. That passes. Any declarations of conflict of interest in here? Seeing and hearing none. At new business, we have at E1 the approval of the 22-23 budget as just passed by and read out and passed by at our committee. Do I have support for that? Trustee Sipcar and Trustee Sartori, all in support. The recommendation in front of us. And that passes. Thank you very much, trustees. Thank you, senior administrators. Thank you to anyone who's still watching. And we are adjourned at 7:26. My thanks.